He was standing at the front of the conference room talking about mutual respect and collaborative culture and the particular kind of community that makes a school more than just a building. I was sitting in the third row with my phone in my lap and 3 years of messages on the screen. I raised my hand. Paul Henderson looked at me the way he always looked at me, with the practiced warmth of a man who has spent 20 years making people feel heard without ever actually listening to them. He said, "Sarah, yes." I stood up. I said, "I have something I would like to share with the staff. It relates to what you just said about our culture." He said, "Of course, go ahead." He was smiling. He had no idea what I was about to read out loud, which was the point, which was the reason I had said nothing for 6 weeks since the night Marcia Tate sent me 3 years of her own evidence by accident. I looked down at my phone. I found the first message. I started to read. "Welcome back to the empty chair, where the women who were supposed to stay quiet finally say the whole thing out loud. If you have ever smiled at someone who is laughing at you behind your back, this story is for you. Subscribe before you keep going, because what I read at that staff meeting is something I spent 6 weeks preparing, and I want you to hear every word of it. But I need to start 3 years before that conference room. I need to start with the red pen. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 33 years old and I have been teaching English at Millbrook High School in Columbus, Ohio for 7 years. I love teaching in the specific and unglamorous way that people love work that is hard and meaningful and chronically underpaid. I love the moment when a student who has been certain they cannot write something discovers, in the middle of writing it, that they can. I love the particular silence of a classroom, where everyone is reading and the room feels inhabited in a way it does not feel any other time. I love the red pen, which I know is not fashionable, which I have used to mark student work since my first year, because there is something about red ink on a white page that feels honest to me, like the work is being taken seriously enough to be corrected. My red pen lives on the right side of my desk during the school day. Every teacher at Millbrook knows it is there. It has become, over 7 years, the kind of small identifying detail that becomes shorthand for a person. Sarah's red pen, Sarah's third-row seat at the staff meeting. Sarah, who always brings her own tea because the staff room coffee tastes like regret. I was not trying to be a character. I was just being consistent, which is something I believe in professionally and personally, and which, as it turns out, made me a reliable target for people who needed something to talk about. I came to Millbrook at 26, fresh from my credential program, with the particular combination of idealism and anxiety that characterizes first-year teachers, and that experienced teachers either find charming or exhausting depending on their mood. The school had a strong English department, a reputation for academic rigor, and a staff that had been largely stable for a long time. I understood that meant there were relationships, histories, and dynamics already in place that I would need to navigate carefully. I navigated them by being useful. I want to tell you about the 3 years before I found the chat, because those years are the context without which none of the rest makes sense. In my first year, I made a mistake that many new teachers make, which is to assume that professional warmth and professional community are the same thing. They are not. Professional warmth is a skill. Professional community is a choice. Marcia Tate was very skilled at professional warmth and had made very clear choices about who was inside her community and who was adjacent to it. And within my first semester, I had been placed firmly in the adjacent category without being told why or given any meaningful opportunity to change it. I adapted the way you adapt when you're new to an environment and trying to read it accurately. I watched how the social dynamics worked. I noticed who sat with whom at the end-of-year dinner, and who arrived at optional staff gatherings, and who seemed genuinely at ease in the staff room versus who was performing ease. I was in the latter category, though I was getting better at the performance, and I told myself that this was simply how new environments worked and that belonging was a thing that accumulated over time. What I did not know was that the chat had started in my second year, shortly after I had been there long enough for the novelty of my presence to wear off and for Marcia to have formed a settled view. I did not know that the first message about the green cardigan had been posted on a Thursday in October of my second year. The same week I had organized a voluntary after-school reading group that 7 students had attended and that I had considered a small professional success. I did not know that the caption catalog for middle-aged librarians had been sent at 7:47 in the evening on a day I had stayed until 5:30 helping a student who was struggling with her college essay. I know all of this now because I read the timestamps. When you have access to 4,000 messages and you're thorough by training, you read the timestamp it's. The year of the breakup was my third year, and it was the hardest year professionally for reasons that had nothing to do with the breakup. I had a difficult class, not in terms of behavior, but in terms of motivation, a group of students who had arrived in 11th grade with the settled belief that they were not readers and not writers, and that no amount of instruction was going to change either of those facts. I believed otherwise. I spent more time and more energy on that class than on any I had taught before, trying different approaches, staying late, calling parents, consulting with colleagues who had taught the same students the year before. At the end of the year, 4 of those students wrote in their final reflections that the class had changed something for them. One of them wrote that she had read a book all the way through for the first time in her life. I kept that reflection. It is in the folder on my desk where I keep the things students write that I want to remember. In the chat, my third year was described as the year she really doubled down on the whole thing. The whole thing being, as far as I could reconstruct from context, the quality of trying too hard in an environment that had decided trying hard was its own form of misalignment. I want to be honest about what I felt when I read that during the 2 hours of reading on the February evening. I felt something I'm going to call grief, because I think that is the most accurate word for the specific experience of having something you did with genuine care dismissed in a private conversation as evidence of a personality flaw. I felt it clearly, and I noted it, and I continued reading, because the feeling and the reading were both necessary, and they did not interfere with each other. I have learned, from years of marking student work, that the feeling that a piece of writing produces in you and the assessment you make of it are related but separate, and that the most useful thing you can do is hold both at once without letting either one erase the other. I cried on Friday. Not Thursday evening, when I was reading, because the reading required the part of me that does not cry. Not on Friday morning, when I went to school and taught 3 classes and smiled at Marcia in the hallway and said thank you about the cardigan. I cried on Friday evening, alone in my apartment, after I had made dinner and washed the dishes and sat down with the intention of organizing more screenshots, and instead found that I could not pick up the phone. I sat on my couch for about an hour. I thought about 7 years of trying. I thought about the Friday food I had brought to the staff room, which had been received warmly and eaten, and which had been discussed in the chat as very on brand for her. I thought about the committee work and the covered classes and the Sunday evening emails. I thought about Paul Henderson calling me dedicated and student-centered and then typing hey on his phone at 7:49 in the evening. And then I cried. And I let myself cry for as long as it took, which was about 40 minutes. Then I washed my face and made tea and picked up the phone and started organizing the screenshots. Because the crying was true and it needed to happen, and then it was done, and what came after it was not bravery exactly, but the particular steadiness that arrives when you have stopped avoiding the true thing and started organizing around it. I volunteered for committees. I covered classes when colleagues needed coverage. I brought food to the staff room on Fridays. Nothing elaborate. Just the kind of thing that makes a shared space feel like a place where people are glad to be. I stayed late to help students who needed extra time. I was the teacher who answered emails on Sunday evenings and who could always be counted on to say yes when something needed doing. I am telling you this not to present myself as a martyr. I am telling you this because the portrait of me that existed in that group chat was so specific in its contempt that I want you to understand what it was contemptuous of. It was not contemptuous of a person who was failing or struggling or difficult to work with. It was contemptuous of a person who was trying. When you do not know that a conversation about you is happening, you interpret everything through the lens of what is visible. The visible things were collegial and civil. Marcia Tate smiled at me in the hallway. She asked about my classes with the attentive curiosity of a senior colleague interested in the school's collective project. Paul Henderson complimented my work at 3 consecutive performance reviews, using phrases like dedicated professional and student-centered approach that felt genuine when he said them, and that I have since had to reprocess entirely. I noticed, during those 3 years, that I was not entirely inside the social life of the staff, not excluded exactly, included in the official things, the meetings, the professional development days, the end-of-year dinner. But there was a layer of connection among a subset of my colleagues that I was adjacent to rather than part of. The conversations that happened in the staff room before I arrived and continued after I left. The in-jokes that were explained when I asked about them in a way that made clear the explaining was a courtesy rather than a genuine invitation. I noticed it and I filed it under normal. Because these things take time, what I understand now is that I was reading the symptoms of something I did not have the diagnosis for. The slightly too warm greetings, the conversations that shifted registers when I walked into the staff room. The particular quality of Marcia's unsolicited advice, which always positioned me as someone who needed guidance. I had been cataloging all of this without being able to name what it added up to, and the February evening when my phone lit up with notifications was the moment the catalog became a diagnosis. I stopped adjusting in my 5th year, not dramatically, not as a decision I announced to myself, but gradually, the way you stop doing a thing that is not working when you finally accept that it is not working. I taught my classes. I marked my essays with a red pen. I brought tea. I was professional and collegial and present, and I stopped trying to achieve the version of belonging that was not going to be offered. This is, I think, what Marcia found most irritating about me by year 6. Not the trying, which had been easy to dismiss as earnest and misguided, but the stopping. The stopping without visible distress, the continuing to show up and do my work well without the validation she had never been going to provide. People who expect you to wither when the warmth is withdrawn find it disorienting when you do not. I had stopped waiting for the warmth, and I had become, in some way I could not have predicted, harder to dismiss. Marcia Tate has been teaching mathematics at Millbrook for 14 years. She is 51 years old, and she has the particular authority that accumulates in institutions when a person has been present long enough to become part of the architecture. She knew which parents to call before they called you. She knew which students were going to be difficult before the year started. She knew which administrator to approach about which problem and how to frame the approach so it landed correctly. This knowledge is genuinely valuable, and Marcia deployed it generously with the people she liked. Which is something I want to acknowledge because it is true, and because I'm trying to tell this story accurately, rather than simply, she did not like me. I understood this within my 1st year, not because she was unkind to my face. She was never unkind to my face, but because there is a particular quality of warmth that is actually its own form of distance. Marcia's warmth toward me had that quality from the beginning. She complimented my classroom displays and offered advice I did not ask for with the generous manner of a person who has decided you need guidance. And underneath all of it was the faint but consistent signal that I was not quite right for the environment in some way she had already determined and was not going to explain. I did not know about the group chat for 3 years. I want you to understand that. 3 years of staff meetings and department lunches and the ordinary daily proximity of people who share a workplace, and I did not know I was in the building. I was at the meetings, I was eating lunch in the staff room on Tuesdays, and in a chat called Staff Lounge, which included 17 of my 23 colleagues and our principal. There was a running conversation about me that had been going on since my 2nd year. I found out on a Thursday evening in February. I was at home grading essays, the red pen working through a stack of 11th grade personal narratives. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A notification from a group chat I had not known I was in. Then another, then 3 more in quick succession. I picked up the phone. The chat was called Staff Lounge. There were, by the notification count, somewhere in the range of 4,000 messages above the one that had just arrived. I had been added to the chat by Marcia Tate. The most recent message, the one that triggered my addition, was from Marcia to what was clearly meant to be a different conversation entirely. She had written, "Did you see what she wore today?" Followed by a crying laughing emoji, and then she had added me to the group. I stared at my phone for approximately 30 seconds. Then I put it face down on the desk. Then I picked it back up. Then I scrolled up. I want to tell you what it feels like to scroll through 3 years of messages about yourself written by people who believed you would never see them. It does not feel like a sudden sharp pain. It feels like the moment in a medical examination, when a doctor finds something that explains all the small symptoms you had been filing away as probably nothing, and the explanation is worse than any of the individual symptoms suggested. And yet there is also, beneath the worse, a strange and specific relief at finally knowing what you were looking at. I read for 2 hours. I did not stop to react. I did not cry, not that night. I read carefully and thoroughly, and the red pen of my attention marked every significant passage, except the pen was the screenshot function on my phone, and I was pressing it every few minutes. The early messages were about my clothes. Marcia had started the thread in my second year with a photo she had taken covertly in the staff room, a photo of me at the coffee machine in the green cardigan I wore on Fridays, with the caption, "Does she own anything that isn't from a catalog for middle-aged librarians?" There were 12 responses, 11 laughing emojis, one that said "she means well," which I noted was the closest thing to a defense I received in the entire 3 years, and which came from a colleague named Ruth who I had always liked and who, I now understood, was the only person in that chat who was not entirely comfortable being in it. The messages about clothes continued for several weeks and then expanded. My classroom was discussed. Someone had taken a photo through my window during a lesson and posted it with the caption, "Anyone else notice her students look like they're in a hostage situation?" This produced 15 responses, several of which were specific and unkind enough that I will not repeat them here. And one of them was from Paul Henderson, our principal, who wrote, "Ha," and then followed it with nothing else. Ha, Paul Henderson, who had sat across from me in 3 annual performance reviews and told me I was a valued member of the Millbrook community, had read a description of my students as hostages and responded with "ha." I screenshot that one twice. The messages about my professional practice were the ones I read most carefully, not because they hurt the most, but because they were the most specific. Marcia had described my teaching style to the group as exactly what you get when someone reads too many books about teaching and not enough actual students. Several people had agreed. One had added, "But she works so hard," followed by a facepalm emoji, which is its own specific form of cruelty, the kind that packages condescension as sympathy. My personal life appeared in the chat with less frequency, but more venom. I had gone through a difficult breakup in my 3rd year at Millbrook, which I had mentioned to one colleague in confidence. That confidence had been shared. The breakup was discussed at some length, with a consensus emerging that the situation was not surprising given her whole thing, a phrase that was never defined but that everyone in the chat appeared to understand. Paul Henderson appeared in the chat with some regularity, though not as a primary contributor. He used single-word responses. "Ha," as mentioned. "Yikes," twice. Once, when someone posted a particularly pointed observation about my classroom management during a difficult week, he had written, "Noted," with a period. From the man who conducted my performance reviews and told me I was a valued member of the community. I read until 11:30. Then I put the phone on the charger, washed my face, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while. Not crying, not yet. Thinking. I was thinking about what I had just read and what I was going to do with it. And underneath the thinking there was the beginning of something I did not fully identify until later. The understanding that I had been given, by Marcia's careless thumb, a document that was more useful than anything I could have constructed myself. I did not leave the chat. This is the decision that made everything else possible. I did not announce my presence. I did not respond to any message. I simply stayed a silent additional member of a conversation that now had an audience it did not know about. And in the morning, I got up and went to school and taught my classes and ate lunch in the staff room and smiled at Marcia when she told me the green cardigan was very cozy looking. I said, "Thank you, Marcia. I have always liked this one." If you have ever had to smile at someone whose messages you had read the night before, subscribe and stay with me, because what I built over the next 6 weeks is something I want to walk you through carefully. 6 weeks. That is how long I waited. 6 weeks between the Thursday evening, when Marcia's mistaken addition gave me 3 years of evidence, and the Tuesday afternoon when Paul Henderson stood at the front of the conference room and talked about mutual respect. Every evening after grading, I sat at my kitchen table and organized the screenshots. I had a folder for professional commentary, the messages about my teaching, my classroom, my curriculum. A folder for personal commentary, the messages about my appearance and my life outside school. A folder specifically for Paul Henderson's contributions, which was smaller than the others, but more significant than its size suggested. And a folder I called Context, which contained the messages that established the tone and duration of the chat, the founding messages from Marcia in year 2, The timestamps that demonstrated this had been ongoing and deliberate, rather than occasional and thoughtless. I practiced reading the messages out loud, alone, in my apartment, in the evenings. I wanted to know how long each one took to read. I wanted to know which ones landed hardest and which ones I needed to read without inflection, so the words could do their own work. I wanted to be able to stand in that conference room and read clearly and steadily and without my hands shaking. This required rehearsal. I rehearsed. I thought carefully about what I wanted the outcome to be. I did not want Paul Henderson fired, though what he had done was a significant failure of his professional responsibility. I did not want Marcia publicly humiliated beyond what the situation naturally produced. What I wanted was for the record to exist, for the things that had been said in that chat to be said out loud, in the room where mutual respect was being celebrated, so that the people celebrating it could hear themselves reflected back. I also spent part of those 6 weeks reviewing the school's policies on workplace harassment and professional communication. I noted the relevant sections. I saved them alongside my screenshots. I was going to stand up in that conference room, and I was going to do it on ground that was solid. I want to describe the night before the staff meeting, because I think it is the part of this story that I return to most often when I think about what preparation actually means. I had been at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The summary document was in front of me, 11 pages of dates, authors, and one-sentence descriptions of 214 screenshots. I had read through it 4 times over the course of the 6 weeks. I read it one final time that night, from the first page to the last, and I felt, when I finished, the specific calm that comes when work is complete and what remains is simply execution. I thought about what could go wrong. Paul could ask me to stop before I finished reading the 6 messages. I had a response prepared for that. I will stop as soon as you can tell me which of these messages is inconsistent with a 3-year pattern, because the pattern is what I am demonstrating. He could challenge whether I had the right to have the screenshots. I had reviewed the relevant provisions of Ohio's workplace privacy law and was prepared to cite them. Marcia could interrupt. I had a response prepared for that too, which I will tell you about in a moment because it is the response I am most proud of preparing. What I had not prepared for was the silence. The 8 seconds after I finished reading, before Paul spoke, I had prepared for noise, interruption, challenge, the kind of defensive response that produces more noise, and the silence was more complete than I had anticipated. 23 people in a room, and the only sound was the ventilation system and, at some point during the 8 seconds, a chair shifting on the linoleum somewhere behind me. The silence was, I think, the most important thing that happened in that conference room. It was the room understanding what it had just heard before anyone had decided what to do with the understanding. It was the moment between stimulus and response that is the only moment in which genuine processing occurs, as opposed to the reactive kind. I had not planned for it, and it was better than anything I had planned. After the meeting, on the drive home, I thought about my 9th graders and the lesson on audience. I had told them that the best arguments are the ones where the warrant does not need to be spoken, where the evidence so clearly supports the claim that the connection is visible without explanation. I had told them to aim for that, and to practice it, and to know that achieving it requires more preparation than most people are willing to do. I had prepared for 6 weeks. The silence lasted 8 seconds. I think that is about the right ratio. The annual staff meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in April. I arrived 12 minutes early and sat in my usual place in the 3rd row. I set my phone on the table in front of me rather than in my bag. I had the screenshots organized and accessible. I had the 6 messages I intended to read bookmarked in the original chat. I had a notepad with a sequence written in my own handwriting, so I could follow it without having to think under pressure. Paul opened the meeting at 3:15. The data portion took 40 minutes. The priorities discussion took 20. Then he set down his papers and looked around the room with the expression he wore for the culture portion every year. Warm and slightly elevated. The expression of a man who knows he is about to say something he considers important. He said, "Before we close, I want to take a moment to talk about what makes Millbrook the school it is. It is not the test scores, though I am proud of those. It is not the facilities or the programs or the curriculum, though all of those matter. It is the culture. It is the fact that when I look around this room, I see a team of people who genuinely respect each other, who support each other, who have built something here that I believe is rare and worth protecting," he said. "This school is built on mutual respect." He smiled. He looked directly at me when he said it, the random direction of a gaze moving around a room. But I noted it. He looked directly at me and said, "This school is built on mutual respect." I raised my hand. Paul said, "Sarah, yes?" Still smiling. He expected a question about curriculum or scheduling. He did not yet know what was about to happen. I stood up. I said, "I have something I would like to share with the staff, if that is all right. It relates to what you just said about our culture." He said, "Of course, go ahead." 17 people looked at me with the polite attention of people at the end of a meeting who are hoping the contribution will be brief. I looked down at my phone. I said, 6 weeks ago, I was accidentally added to a group chat called Staff Lounge. I understand it has been running for approximately 3 years. I have been reading it since I was added. I would like to read some of it to the group now." The room changed. Marcia, sitting 2 rows behind me, and to my left, went very still in the way that people go still when they have understood something before the thing has fully arrived. The colleague beside her turned to look at her. Ruth, at the far end of the 3rd row, looked at her hands. Paul Henderson's smile stayed on his face for approximately 2 seconds after the moment it should have ended. I read the first message. "The one about the green cardigan. Does she own anything that isn't from a catalog for middle-aged librarians?" I read it in my teacher voice, the same voice I use when I'm reading a passage aloud in class, clear and even, and without editorial comment. I let the words be what they were. Nobody laughed. The message had originally been sent with a laughing emoji and 12 responses, and now it was being read in a room of 23 people, and nobody laughed. I read the second message, the one about the hostage situation. Then I read Paul Henderson's response. "Ha, just ha." I read it the same way I read the first one, clear and even. I looked up briefly after reading his response, found his face, held it for 1 second, and then looked back at my phone. I read 6 messages in total. At 6, I had reached the point where the room was receiving them completely, and continuing would have been more than was necessary. The 6 messages covered the span of 3 years. They covered the range of content, professional, personal, appearance-based. One included Paul's name as a participant. One was the message about my breakup that had come from a confidence I had shared privately. I read that one without looking up, because I did not want to see the face of the colleague who had shared it. When I finished, I put my phone down on the table. I said I have approximately 200 additional screenshots if anyone would like to review them. I said it neutrally as a statement of fact rather than a threat. Then I sat down. Paul Henderson did not speak for a long time. I counted approximately 8 seconds, which in a silent room full of 23 people is a very long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost the warmth from the culture address. He said, "Sarah, I think we should discuss this privately." I said, "I'm happy to discuss it privately as well." I wanted to discuss it in this setting first because the conversation that produced these messages happened in a group setting, and I thought it was appropriate for the response to happen in the same way. He looked at me, and I think he was deciding whether to challenge the logic of that and deciding he could not. Marcia spoke next, without raising her hand. She said, "I want to say that the chat was never meant to be hurtful. It was just staff blowing off steam, the way everyone does." I turned around in my chair to look at her when she said this, which I had practiced, because I wanted to be looking at her face when she offered the explanation, and I wanted her to know I was looking. I said, "I understand that is how it felt from inside the chat. From outside it, reading 3 years of messages about my clothes, my teaching, and my personal life, it felt like something else." Then I said, "Marcia, you took a photograph of me without my knowledge and posted it in a group chat with a mocking caption. I'm not sure that is something you would have said to my face." She did not respond. Ruth spoke from the far end of the 3rd row. She said, "I want to say that I was uncomfortable with the chat and that I reduced my participation because of that discomfort. I should have said something directly to Sarah or to administration, and I did not. I'm sorry for that." She said it looking at me rather than at the room, which was the right way to say it. I said, Thank you, Ruth. I meant it. The meeting ended 10 minutes later without resolution of any kind, which was the correct outcome. Resolutions take time and process, and a staff meeting is not the place for either. Paul said he would be scheduling individual conversations over the following week. He said the school would be reviewing its policies on staff communication. He said he hoped everyone would approach the coming conversations with the same commitment to community that Millbrook had always embodied, which was a sentence he clearly regretted as soon as it left his mouth, and which produced a silence that was its own response. I picked up my phone, my notepad, and my red pen, walked out of the conference room and down the hall to my classroom, sat at my desk, looked at the stack of 11th grade essays I still needed to finish marking, picked up the red pen, and marked them. Stay with me, because the conversations that followed in the next 2 weeks are the part of the story I have never told in full. Paul met with me privately on Wednesday and said things that were more honest than I had expected from him, including an acknowledgement that his participation in the chat, even in the limited form it had taken, was a failure of his responsibility as a principal. He said it without the warmth which made it more credible. The school conducted a formal review. I cooperated fully and expected thoroughness. He said it would be thorough. Several colleagues apologized, some briefly, and in passing, the kind of apology that is really an acknowledgement that they were present for something they should not have been. 2 more substantially, in conversations that lasted long enough to be real. The colleague who had shared my confidence about the breakup apologized in a way that I believed, which was unexpected, and which I accepted without elaborating on how much it had hurt, because the elaboration would not have helped either of us. The formal review found that the staff lounge chat constituted a pattern of workplace behavior inconsistent with the school's stated values and professional standards. It found that Paul's participation, even in limited form, represented a conflict with his obligations as an administrator. Several colleagues received formal written notices. The chat was disbanded. A new communication policy was implemented. Paul Henderson is still the principal of Millbrook High School. I know some people will find this unsatisfying. He received a formal reprimand documented in his personnel file, which matters in ways that are not always immediately visible. He no longer looks at me the way he looked at me before, which was the way you look at someone you have already categorized and set aside. He looks at me now the way you look at someone you're still figuring out. That is an improvement. Marcia Tate is still teaching mathematics at Millbrook. She has not started a new group chat, as far as I know. We are civil in the way that people are civil when they are sharing a workplace, and have decided that civility is the minimum viable option. On some days it is more than that. On most days it is exactly that, and no more, which is enough. I thought about leaving after everything that happened. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I stayed without it costing me anything is not the true version. I thought about it seriously for several weeks, and I decided to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with the people who had been in the chat and everything to do with the students who had not been. My 11th graders were in the middle of their personal narratives. My 9th graders were just beginning to understand that an argument needs evidence and not just assertion. I had been their teacher for 7 months, and I was going to finish the year. I finished the year. I came back for the 8th. I want to tell you about the formal review process in more detail, because the process is where a lot of these stories quietly end without resolution, and I want to be precise about what resolution actually looked like in this case. The review was conducted by a team from the district office over 3 weeks. I met with the lead reviewer twice. She was a careful, thorough woman who asked specific questions and wrote down the answers without visible reaction, which is the professional manner of someone who has seen many versions of this kind of situation and is committed to not letting her prior experience shape her response to the current one. I respected that. I gave her the summary document, the screenshots organized by category, and the relevant policy provisions I had identified during my 6 weeks of preparation. She thanked me for the organization. I said, I teach writing. Organization is the job. The review found in formal language that the staff lounge chat constituted a sustained pattern of workplace conduct inconsistent with the school's professional standards and values. That Paul Henderson's participation, even in the form of single-word responses, represented a material conflict with his obligations as a building administrator, and that the school's existing communication policies were insufficient to address the conditions that had allowed the chat to operate undetected for 3 years. Paul received a formal written reprimand and was required to complete additional professional development in administrative ethics and workplace culture. 5 of the most active participants in the chat received formal written notices in their personnel files. The remaining participants received verbal counseling. The chat was formally disbanded, and a new policy was implemented requiring all staff communications on school matters to occur through official channels. I was informed of these outcomes in a meeting that lasted 35 minutes. The district representative read from the document in a voice designed to be neither warm nor cold, which I appreciated. Paul sat across the table and looked at the document rather than at me for most of the meeting. At the end, the district representative asked if I had any questions. I said, 1. What is the timeline for implementation of the new communication policy? She told me. I thanked her and I left. On the way to my car, I stopped in the hallway outside my classroom and looked through the window at the room where I had been teaching for 7 years. The desks were arranged the way I always arranged them, in groups of 4 rather than rows, because I believe discussion requires proximity, and proximity requires a specific geometry. The whiteboard still had the vocabulary words from the previous week's lesson in my handwriting. The red pen was on the right side of my desk where it always was. I stood there for a moment, then I went home. The year after the staff meeting had a particular quality that I want to describe accurately, because I think the year after is as important as the moment itself and is rarely discussed with the same attention. The staff room was different. Not in any dramatic way. The furniture was the same, the coffee was still bad, the Friday food still appeared, but the social temperature was different. The particular ease that belongs to a group of people who share a private understanding had been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. The ease of people who are aware that the assumptions they have been operating on may not hold in the ways they thought they did. Several colleagues had changed their behavior toward me in ways that were genuine rather than performative. I could tell the difference because the genuine changes were specific. They asked about particular students, they referenced particular class projects, they engaged with the content of my professional life rather than the surface of my presence. The performative changes were generalized and slightly too warm and arrived in the first 2 weeks after the meeting and then faded as the situation became less acute and the social attention moved on to other things. I did not track the changes carefully. I noticed them and I moved through them and I let the year do its work, which is what years do when you allow them to. Ruth and I have become genuinely close in the year since the staff meeting, not the careful collegial friendly that we were before, but the real kind where you can say difficult things and trust they will be received carefully. She told me she had known the chat was wrong from the beginning and had not known how to exit it without calling attention to her exit, and that she had been carrying that for 3 years and was glad it was over. I told her I understood. I do understand. The cost of speaking up in a group where the power is distributed a certain way is a real cost, and I do not hold Ruth responsible for not paying it earlier. I hold her responsible for the apologies she gave me, which she has paid in full. I want to tell you one more thing about Marcia Tate, because I think her absence from the resolution of this story is itself part of the story and deserves to be addressed directly rather than allowed to sit as an unexamined gap. Marcia did not apologize. I have said this already, but I want to say it again with more precision, because the fact of the non-apology is more complicated than it first appears. In the 2 weeks after the staff meeting, when other colleagues were finding me in hallways and in the staff room and occasionally leaving notes in my mailbox, Marcia was doing none of those things. She was coming to school and teaching her classes and navigating the changed social temperature of the building with the particular posture of a person who has been found out and is waiting to see what finding out actually costs. I watched this from my end of the hallway, and I thought about it with the same attention I had given to the 6 weeks of preparation. What I concluded was that the absence of the apology was not a choice in the usual sense, a deliberate decision made among alternatives, but rather a reflection of the fact that Marcia had not arrived at a place where an apology was available to her. She had not, as far as I could tell from the available evidence, shifted her understanding of what she had done from something that got discovered to something that was wrong. Those are not the same thing, and you cannot apologize for the latter if you're still thinking in terms of the former. This is not a charitable reading of Marcia's position. I want to be honest that I arrived at it partly through observation, and partly through the particular clarity that 3 years of someone's private messages about you produces, which is an unusually complete picture of how that person's mind works when they believe no one is watching. The mind I read in those 4,000 messages was one that organized the social world around categories of people who were correctly placed and people who were not quite right, and that used the chat as a space for processing the discomfort of the not quite right category through collective dismissal. That mind was not going to produce a genuine apology in the 2 weeks after a staff meeting, and I did not expect one, and I was not injured by its absence. What I want to say about Marcia, in the end, is something that I think is more true than comfortable, which is that she is a good teacher. Not a good colleague, not in the way the word should mean, but in the classroom, which is where the work actually happens. She is skilled and consistent and takes her students seriously, and they learn from her. I know this not from the chat, which contained almost nothing about her professional practice, but from 7 years of being in the same building and observing what happens to students over time, and being able to trace some portion of what happens to the teachers they had before they got to me. Marcia's students arrive in my class with a mathematical rigor of thought that is useful and real and that I cannot produce in the same way she can. I find this complicated to hold. I want to be honest that I find it complicated, because the simpler version of the story is cleaner and does not require me to hold the contempt and the competence together in the same hand. But the simpler version is not the true version, and the true version is the one I'm committed to telling. The formal reprimand is in her personnel file. The chat is gone. We are civil. She teaches well, I teach well. The students, who are the whole point, are served by both of us in the ways that we are each able to serve them. This is not the resolution I would have chosen if I had been designing the situation from the beginning. It is the resolution that exists, and I have made my peace with it in the way that you make peace with things that are not going to be what they should have been, which is by deciding that what they are is enough to keep working with. I have been at Millbrook for 8 years now. My 9th graders from the year of the staff meeting are in 11th grade, old enough to have heard some version of what happened, which travels through a school the way these things travel, imprecisely and inevitably. A few of them have asked me about it directly. I have told them each time a version that is honest without being comprehensive, which is the version appropriate for the context. I told them that sometimes the workplace presents you with information you were not supposed to have, and that what you do with that information is a measure of what you actually believe about fairness and accountability. I told them that the most important thing is to be very clear about what you believe before you act on it, because acting is irrevocable, and belief is the only foundation that makes irrevocable action something you can stand behind. One of them asked whether I was scared. I said, yes. Which was true. I said I was scared and I did it anyway, which is not bravery in any dramatic sense, but is, I think, the ordinary form of it, the form available to most people in most situations if they are willing to do the preparation first and then stand up when the preparation is complete. Another student asked what I had been most afraid of. I thought about it for a moment before answering, because the question deserved a real answer rather than a performed one. I said I was most afraid that I would lose my composure while reading, that my voice would change or my hands would shake and the room would focus on that instead of on the words. She nodded. She said, but it didn't happen. I said no, because I had practiced until it couldn't. She wrote that down in her notebook, which I noticed and did not comment on, because sometimes the most important thing a teacher can do is not draw attention to the moment of learning while it is happening. I have thought a great deal, in the months since, about what I want the shape of my professional life to look like going forward. Not in the large architectural sense. I know what I'm doing and where I'm doing it, and I have made my peace with both. I mean in the smaller sense. The daily sense, the sense of what I want to bring to the classroom and to the institution in the years after a year like this one. What I have arrived at is something simple, which I offer not as wisdom but as what has actually been useful to me. I want to continue to be the person who tries, not despite the fact that trying was what made me a target, but because of it. The contempt in that chat was aimed at effort and at consistency and at the particular quality of showing up the same way every day, regardless of whether the showing up was rewarded. I do not want to change any of those things. I want to continue to be that person. In the classroom and in the staff room and in the third row at the annual staff meeting, with the red pen and the tea and the green cardigan on Fridays. What I also want, and what the 6 weeks of preparation gave me, is the understanding that trying and being strategic about trying are not mutually exclusive. I try hard, I also keep records. I try with warmth, and I also know the relevant policy provisions. These things are compatible, and the experience of holding them together, the effort and the evidence, the care and the documentation, is something I want to carry forward as a permanent feature of how I work rather than a response to a specific situation. The red pen runs out every 8 weeks or so. I replace it with an identical one from the drawer in my desk, where I keep a supply of them. The replacement takes about 30 seconds, and nobody notices, which is as it should be. The continuity is what matters. The fact that the pen is there every day, in the same place, doing the same work, marking what is correct and what needs correction, and what shows genuine effort and what is almost there but not yet. I put a mark next to that last one always. Almost there but not yet. Not a failing grade. A direction. Something to return to. Something worth the returning. I want to say something about the colleagues who were in that chat who were not the primary contributors. Not Marcia, who was the architect, not Paul, whose participation was its own category of failure, but the 12 or 13 colleagues who had responded with laughing emojis and brief additions, who had been, for the most part, following a lead rather than setting one. They were not, for the most part, bad people. They were people who had been invited into a space with a particular social logic, that discussing Sarah Calloway was a form of group bonding, and they had participated in that logic without examining it very carefully. This is a common human behavior, and I understand it. What I want to say is this: the laughing emoji is a choice. It is a small choice, made in a private space, with no immediate consequence, and it feels like nothing at the moment of making it. But the laughing emoji, multiplied by 12 people in 3 years, is the environment that a person walks into every morning when they come to work. It is the reason the hallway feels slightly off. It is the reason the staff room conversations shift when someone arrives. The laughing emoji is the smallest unit of the thing I spent 3 years reading without being able to name. And I want anyone who has ever sent one to sit with that for a moment. Not with guilt, necessarily, but with awareness. I told my 9th graders this year that audience matters. That a piece of writing is shaped by who will read it, and that the best writers carry their audience in mind through every sentence. I told them that words written carelessly still land, and that the landing is real even if the writer never intended it. They wrote better essays after that conversation than they had written before it. I still have the screenshots. They are in a folder on my phone and on my computer, and in 2 backup locations, not because I intend to use them further, but because they exist and they are mine. And keeping evidence is something I believe in. I want to say one more thing before I let this story go. It is about the green cardigan. I still have it. It hangs on the hook on the back of my bedroom door, and I wear it on Fridays, which is what I was doing when Marcia took the photo, which is what I was doing the day she told me it was very cozy looking, and which is what I was doing on the Friday after the staff meeting, when I walked into the school building, hung my coat, put on the green cardigan, and taught my classes. I wore it deliberately that Friday, not as a statement or a provocation. I wore it because it is a good cardigan and I like it, and it is what I wear on Fridays, and the fact of the chat and the staff meeting and the screenshots was not going to change what I wear on Fridays. This is the most ordinary form of persistence I know, and it is the form I trust most, not the grand gesture, the unremarkable continuation, the red pen, the third row, the green cardigan on Fridays, the things that were always there, that have always been there, that will continue to be there because they are mine, and I like them, and nobody in a group chat has the authority to take them from me, not even retroactively, not even with 4,000 messages and 3 years of laughing emojis and a principal's hey in the archive of a chat that no longer exists. I am still here, the cardigan is still green. That is the whole of the ending. If someone in your life has been treating your absence as an opportunity, if there is a room somewhere where people who smile at you are saying other things when you're not there, Hear this: you do not need to perform not knowing. You're allowed to know. You're allowed to wait. You are allowed to stand up at the meeting, open your phone, and read what was written in the same building where mutual respect is the stated value, and let the words be exactly what they are. There is something I want to say about the specific experience of sitting in a room where you know something that the room does not know you know. And I want to say it because I think it is the part of this story that is most commonly misunderstood when people hear it from the outside. The 6 weeks between finding the chat and the staff meeting were not 6 weeks of anger. I want to be clear about that because I think the natural assumption is that the intervening period was one of sustained fury, of building pressure that was finally released in the conference room. That is not what they were. They were 6 weeks of work, and the work had a quality that I can only describe as clarifying, the specific clarity that arrives when you have a difficult situation that is complex and you have broken it down into its components and are addressing each component in sequence. I was angry, certainly. The anger was real and it was proportionate, and I did not try to suppress it or talk myself out of it, because anger at something genuinely unjust is information, and suppressing information is always a mistake. But the anger was not the operational state. The operational state was something more like the focus I have when I'm grading a difficult batch of essays. The essays where the students have clearly worked hard but have made fundamental structural errors that require careful diagnosis rather than quick correction. That focus, the focus that requires you to be fully present with the material and fully aware of what you're trying to produce. What I was trying to produce was a moment in which the truth was visible in a room where a specific untruth had been performed for an extended period. That is a production problem. It has logistical requirements. It requires the right material, which I had deployed in the right setting, which I identified at the right moment, which I recognized when Paul said mutual respect and looked directly at me. The anger informed the choice to produce the moment. The focus is what made the production possible. I have thought about this distinction a great deal since the staff meeting, and I have come to believe that it is one of the most practically important distinctions available to a person in a difficult situation. The anger tells you that something is wrong and that it matters. The focus tells you what to do about it and how to do it in a way that actually changes something, rather than simply expressing the anger in a form that makes you feel better for a moment and leaves the underlying situation unchanged. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient without the other. My students write personal narratives every spring, and the assignment requires them to describe a moment in which they made a decision and to analyze what went into making it. The narratives I find most interesting are not the ones in which the decision was dramatic, though dramatic decisions produce readable narratives, but the ones in which the student is honest about the process, about the gap between knowing that something is wrong and knowing what to do about it, about the time that passes in that gap and what fills it. The best of those narratives are the ones where the student has understood that the gap is not a failure of courage, but a space of preparation, and that what fills the gap is work, and that the work is as much the story as the decision that comes out of it. I think about that when I mark those narratives with the red pen. I think about the 6 weeks and the summary document and the folder of screenshots and the timing rehearsals and the policy research and the notepad with the sequence written in my own handwriting. I think about all of the work that happened between the Thursday evening in February and the Tuesday afternoon in April, and I think about the fact that none of that work was visible in the conference room. What was visible was only the 6 messages and the 8 seconds of silence, and I think about how much of what matters in any story is invisible to the people watching it. The gap is the story. The gap is always the story. The moment is just the moment the gap becomes visible to everyone else. There is a student in my current 11th grade class who reminds me of myself at that age, not in appearance or background, but in the quality of her attention and the way she treats her work as something worth taking seriously in a social environment that does not always reward seriousness. She brings a different pen to every class, which I noticed in September and which I have said nothing about, because she will arrive at her own version of the red pen eventually, and the arriving is part of the point. She submitted her personal narrative last week. It was about a moment in which she had known something that a group of people around her did not know, and had decided to stay quiet until the right moment to speak. The narrative was not autobiographical in any way that mapped onto my situation. It was about a family dinner and a piece of information that had changed the dynamic of the table when she finally said it. But the structure of it, the gap between knowing and speaking, the work that happened in the gap, the choice of moment was something I recognized completely. I wrote at the bottom of the last page, in red ink, "The gap is the story. You understood this, well done." She will not know exactly what I meant by the first sentence. She will know exactly what I meant by the second. Both of those things are fine. The red pen is on the desk. She is in the third row. We are both, in our different ways, paying attention. That is enough. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Share this with someone who has been smiling at people who do not deserve the smile. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.